Hello and welcome to your next Menopause Morning. This is a very important show for you today because we're defining something that's very important. Yeah, because what we're going to define, these two things have two different meanings, and very often, a lot of women in menopause, perhaps yourself, think they're really the same thing. And what I'm talking about here is the difference between a hot flash and a night sweat. Now, even to recognize a hot flash, that's tied into what's going on with your hormones. And hot flashes will, and when you do have significant issues with your hormonal system that is throwing you into hot flashes, these can happen literally throughout the day at any point. It could be early in the day, midday, late into the day, into the evening. And the hot flash itself is really tied into, like, a lot of times you're told that a hot flash is just low estrogen. And really, what a hot flash is when your estrogen either hits a peak or hits a valley. Yeah, so if your estrogen maintains a good balance through the day, you're probably not going to have a hot flash. But when you hit a low point, when you hit a valley, that low point, you're going to have a hot flash. Or if you have a peak and the estrogen goes up really high for a variety of different reasons, at the peak, you can have a hot flash. Yeah. So, and this is all tied into what's going on hormonally. Now, it's not because you have this horrific thing called menopause. It's because you've gone from childbearing years into perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause with an HPA axis, excuse me, which stands for your hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal axis. This simply isn't working. Yeah, because the reality is if your HPA axis is working properly, you will transition from childbearing years into perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopausal with really great ease. Remember, you've probably heard me say this many times before, but the only two true symptoms of menopause is you stop having a monthly cycle and you can't conceive. All the other symptoms that you refer to as menopause symptoms, like the hot flashes, the weight gain, the brain fog, the moodiness, the overall insomnia, the fatigue, you know the list, right? But those aren't really symptoms of menopause. Those are symptoms of entering perimenopause and menopause with a hormonal system that isn't functioning optimally anymore. Because when your HPA axis, remember that's your hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal axis, when those are working correctly when you enter the cycle, the only things that are going to happen is you're not going to have a monthly cycle anymore and you're not going to conceive. Yet, unfortunately, for about 85% of the women, and there's literally about 2 million women in our country enter menopause every year, 15% of them, their HPA axis is working well, and they are only dealing with a lack of a monthly cycle and an inability to conceive, which honestly, I've been working with women for 21 and a half years with hormones, and most women are pretty excited about not having a monthly cycle and not being able to conceive anymore at this point, right? But then the challenge with this, that means that 85% of you, and perhaps you specifically, are having what you do refer to as menopause symptoms. And one of those obviously could be the hot flashes. And the one thing I just want you to understand before I start defining the difference between this as a night sweat is, even if you are having hot flashes, you can achieve a natural hormone balance again. And it's really tied into getting your HPA axis back into balance, and also getting to the underlying triggers of what caused the hormonal balance in the first place. This is something I tell all of my clients all the time. Your hormonal system is just a response system. Yeah, so even when your hormonal system is off, the problem really isn't your hormonal system. The problem is whatever caused that response in the first place. These triggers, most notably and most commonly in my practice, I see these triggers not only just tied into mental and emotional stress, but also tied into inflammatory stress, very often driven by infections in your gut or food sensitivities you're unaware of or toxicity you're unaware of, and the list goes on. But here's the great news for you: is you can understand your triggers, you can address your triggers, and you can help to support your hormonal system during this time, so you can eventually get back to the point which is where your body should be, where you still maintain a perfect hormone balance even after menopause, because that HP axis is working again. So I want to mention that because I think that's so important. Now, let's look at the night sweat. Now, a lot of times I will have women who will tell me, well, I'm having these hot flashes and I wake up in a pool of sweat and my temperature is so high at night and they're going on and on about what's going on. And my first question always is, does this only happen at night during your bedtime, or is that happening throughout the day? And if the answer is, oh well, no, it I only get the hot flashes at night, well, guess what? That's not a hot flash. That's a night sweat, and it's very different. You see, I already defined what the hot flash is and tied into the basically the fluctuation of estrogens throughout your day. Remember, if they hit a peak or a valley, you're going to have a hot flash during that time. But really, the night sweat only happens at night, doesn't happen during the day. And you're definitely going to feel a rise in temperature and there's going to be perspiration. But the night sweat is not tied into the fluctuation of estrogens. If that was the case, that would be fluctuating throughout the day. But the night sweats are really an immune response. So when you have infections in your body, and I would say that most notably, the infections in your body are really infections in your gut. And I see this all the time with women who, very often where women are dealing with multiple infections in the gut, maybe multiple different types of bacterial infections, sometimes parasites, sometimes H. pylori infections, sometimes some form of candida or yeast or fungus. But there's a host of things that could be going on in your gut. And what happens though is then when you go to sleep, you're going to have your most significant immune response of the day. So if your body has infections in the gut, and there could be infections elsewhere in the body, of course, but they're most notably in the gut. So what your body is doing is your body is basically putting forth an immune response. And part of that immune response, it is raising your body temperature to help combat and to destroy these pathogens or these infections in your gut. And during that time when you're having this immune response, and in essence, what's happening is your temperature is going up, you're perspiring, you are waking up in that little pool of sweat. That's your immune system trying to get rid of these pathogens. Right. So that's very different than a hot flash. And more importantly, it's a very different causative factor, right? Because if you keep trying to go down a path of this must be a hot flash and it's a problem with my hormones, you're never going to get the answer. And here's the kicker, because when you have infections in your gut, those infections drive an inflammatory response. Very often, those infections drive food sensitivities, recognizing too that about 86% of the people who have a food sensitivity, you're asymptomatic. So it's not like you necessarily eat the food and you feel terrible right after, but that food sensitivity that you're asymptomatic of is still driving an inflammatory response. And then here's the kind of the kicker of all this. So when you have the infections in your gut, those are driving an inflammatory response. The infections in your gut are now driving food sensitivities that you're unaware of. So now you're eating something that's driving an inflammatory response. Those are all triggers to really deplete your HPA axis, to deplete the function of your hormonal system. Because when you're chronically inflamed because of infections in your gut, and then you throw on top of that some food sensitivities that you're unaware of, you're in a chronic state of inflammation. And where do you think your body takes care of that? Your body takes care of that by creating a hormone called cortisone, which is your body's natural anti-inflammatory. So when you're chronically, when and this happens all the time where women are living with, and this could be you right now, where you're living with these infections and pathogens in your gut, and you might have been living with these for the last 10 years, constantly driving the inflammatory response. And the longer you go with the infections, the higher likelihood it is that you're going to have a food sensitivity. So now you've got a couple other things driving a regular inflammatory response on a consistent basis. And what that's doing is it's putting your hormonal system into a chronic state of fight or flight, because you're constantly going down the path to produce more cortisone and more cortisol to help you deal with the infection in the body. And then the more that you're going down that path, so this is what's important to recognize, the more you go down the path with your hormones to create cortisone and cortisol, the less vitality you have in your hormonal system to go down the path of DHEA, testosterone, and estrogens. Yeah, so the longer when you're dealing with a hot flash, and that's a causative factor based on infections in your gut, again, driving inflammation, driving the potential of food sensitivities, driving even more inflammation. In essence, what's going on is that could be one of the most significant factor as to why you're dealing with, hormonal imbalance in the first place. So what's really important with this is when you do recognize that, yes, I do have to take care of this. You really have to look at what's going on in your gut. And I see this all the time with the women that I work with, where I get the stool results back, and there's multiple detrimental bacteria. You're dealing things with things like Escherichia coli, Citrobacter, Klebsiella, Enterobacter, Enterococcus, and sometimes parasites, sometimes an H. pylori infection. Very often, when I see the bacterial infections, I also see some kind of yeast or candida infections as well. And you can figure this out though. A very simple, well, simple. I say simple because I've done it many times myself, and I recommend it to my clients all the time. But it's not the most enjoyable test in the world. It's a 3-day stool collection. And to be candid, nobody really enjoys collecting their stool on a daily basis. Yet, what I will tell you though is what you get back from that test to define what's driving these night sweats for you, and also what's driving the inflammatory response, what's driving the food sensitivities, what's driving then an additional inflammatory response to the food sensitivities. In the end, what's driving everything you're dealing with from a hormone perspective, because this is one of the biggest of the triggers of what's really causing the hormonal imbalance in the first place for really most of the women that I'm working with. And this could be you. So now with the definition of the difference between a hot flash and also a night sweat, if you are the person who's dealing with regular night sweats, what you really want to look at is you want to look at a comprehensive stool collection. And I use a lab called Genova Labs. I use a test that's called the GI Effects Microbial Profile, and I do an add-on for an H. pylori. And what we get out of that test is like borderline remarkable for almost every woman that I work with. And also to recognize, just to repeat what I said earlier, if you've had long-term chronic issues with infections in your gut, you likely have food sensitivities. And remember, 86% of the people who have a food sensitivity are asymptomatic. So you could be eating the food and not even recognize that you're driving this constant inflammatory response. And then remember, the kicker with this is when you have the infections, when you have the food sensitivities, when you have the inflammatory responses going on a consistent chronic basis, that could be the whole causative factor of why you're even dealing with the hormone imbalance in the first place. So when you start to put this all together, and you do really recognize what's truly going on with your hormonal system, you work on supporting your hormonal system naturally at the foundational levels, and then you uncover the triggers. That's your opportunity to not only eliminate the hot flash, but really to also eliminate, even if you're having hot flashes, but then you also separately have the night sweats. That's your opportunity to basically, for yourself, turn back the clock and feel young again. And what I'd like you to just take a moment right now, and I want you to just, you could either, if you have pen and paper in front of you, you could write this down, or you can just think this to yourself. But are you dealing with hot flashes? Are you dealing with night sweats? Are you dealing with both? And most women do recognize the difference of the hot flash comes on typically such a sudden shift in temperature, and it can happen again at any point during the day. Whereas the night sweat is usually a slower production of the increase in temperature. And most women explain it to me that the night sweat feels much different than the hot flash. And just to recognize that if you are having night sweats, you likely have infections in your gut, and you can address this. And if we find that if we get that test back and you do have multiple infections, and high levels of infections, well, then we can also, be, pretty certain that you probably have food sensitivity as well. And we can, again, we can address that. We can figure out what those foods are. Yes. And I just want you to recognize that there are options for you to get this all balanced naturally. Going back to what I said earlier, 2 million women in the US enter menopause every single year, and 15% of them only stop having a monthly cycle and can't conceive. So if you're part of the 85%, what I want you to recognize is you can become a part of the 15%. And I see that all the time in my practice. Yeah. So, and then the last question is, well, what if you have hot flashes and you don't do anything about it? Or more importantly, what if you have night sweats and you don't do anything about it? What if you continue to live with multiple bacterial infections in your gut, and maybe an H. pylori, maybe some yeast or candida? What if you do that? Well, it doesn't, honestly, it doesn't end well, because that when you have these infections in your gut, it is driving inflammation, as I talked about. It actually hinders your absorption and assimilation. It affects your digestion. Anything that happens in your gut also happens in the brain and the immune system. So now you're weakening immunity and you're depleting the function of your brain. And you know what? If you don't do anything about infections in your gut, it does not end well. And what if you do? What if you have night sweats and then you do a 3-day comprehensive stool collection? You recognize all the infections, all the pathogens you have in your gut, and you take care of those. And you no longer have night sweats. You're no longer dealing with this high level of inflammation. And what I want you to also recognize, when you eliminate that, that's your best opportunity to get back the vitality into your hormonal system. And as I said once before, that's your opportunity to turn back the clock and feel young again. Yeah, so I will put underneath this video, I will put a link so you can get some information on comprehensive stool test collections. And there will also be a comment underneath this to give you an opportunity to receive a free ebook from me, which is called Fat, Fatigued, and Frustrated, which is the very essential foundational aspects of what you need to address to begin your pathway to balance your hormones again. And that book will be for free. And all you'll have to do is give your first name and an email. And that'll also put you on the Menopause Morning list. So that way, every week before I do this, I typically send out an email with what the subject for that week's talk is going to be, and a reminder that the Menopause Morning is coming up. Because every single week, you get high value information based on hormones to help you, again, turn back the clock and feel young again. So with that said, have a fantastic day, and I look forward to your comments. And remember, any comments or questions, just put them below this video and I'll be more than happy to address them. Have a great day.